Well, hello there everyone. Metaphor ReFantazio is a game that felt like a love letter to Atlas games as a whole. From the obvious similarities to both S&T and Persona, to the surprising amount of love shown towards the Etrian Odyssey series, this game felt like a celebration of all things Atlas. It's also got a lot of boss fights, and I decided I wanted to rank them from worst to best, with some caveats. See, there's well over 40 bosses in this game, but a lot of them either don't stand out or are rematches against characters, so I decided I'll only be counting boss fights I either found interesting or significant, and otherwise just clumping together the filler bosses into 1 or 2 entries. But even then, I've still got 27 entries to count, so let's get into it with the worst of the worst.
It's been 9 minutes.
When thinking of what makes a good boss in a turn-based RPG, there are some things that come to mind. Story, music, mechanics, movesets, AI, and ideally some pacing. And out of the mini bosses in this game, nothing misses the mark harder than the rematch with the Great Worm Homo Butera. All he does is whack you and throw out sandstorms over and over again, hitting for honestly not very much damage, while you just spam ice magic over and over again in order to hit his weaknesses to get additional press turns, and eventually defeat him. But that's all you do for almost 9 minutes, because despite being able to access this boss about halfway through the game, maybe even a little bit earlier, his damage isn't that bad either. He's got seemingly in-game levels of health, making for one of the most tedious fights in the entire game. But even though this fight is optional, I still recommend you get it done as soon as you can, because it's required as one of the key pieces to unlock Stroll's ultimate job class. Screw this fight. Number 26, Devourer of Stars. On the other end, instead of a long and boring fight, we have long and ball-crushingly difficult fight. Just a note, I omitted all the other optional dragons from this list because they don't really do that much to stand out other than be beefy in-game bosses, though I will give an honorable mention to Devourer of Flames, as he was actually pretty fun and had a decently unique mechanic. Devourer of Stars also has a unique gimmick in that he reflects everything, meaning that any attacks that hit him will bounce off and instantly end your turn, so the only way to do damage is either go for almighty attacks, which don't do a lot, or force weaknesses on him with the help of Yuna. Or I guess technically anyone else that's got the Mass Dancer going, but let's be real, it's Yuna. So, sounds gimmicky, but alright, I can deal with worse. Except I'm not done, as this boss will always buff his attack to the maximum amount, and he has both Takunda and Dakaja to clear any debuffs on him, and clear any buffs from your party. Okay, that sounds obnoxious. Guess what? I'm still not done, because once the fight begins, he sets the entire party's maximum HP to 300 regardless of whatever it may have been. And all of his physical attacks are capable of inflicting poison, and we're still not done, because he also has a move called Distant Black Howl, which can inflict all kinds of nasty status effects on you, such as Curse, Hex, and Malady. In other words, it's like fighting up a cracked up Malboro from Final Fantasy, but in a game that doesn't have a ribbon, or at least not one that you can get by this point in the game. This is my most hated boss in the game, and the only reason it beats out Butera is because I literally fell asleep fighting that boss, while this one is infuriating enough to keep me awake, on spite alone. Number 25, Zorba. Gotta be honest, I have nothing to say about this fight. I killed him on the second turn and he didn't get off a single attack. And at this point in the game, you've already had 2 other straightforward human bosses, and they both lasted way longer and had far more impact on the characters, while Zorba is just a bad guy that serves Luis as far as we know at this point in the game, and then he seemingly falls off the cathedral walls and dies. There's not really much for me to say on this guy, and there's not much for me to say on this fight, so next. Number 24, the random monster bosses. Things like the Guptaros, the Kamenza, Tree Beast, Alento, etc. This entry is for the mini monsters moonlighting as bosses and mini bosses throughout the game. They're not bad, but they're not too interesting compared to the major boss fights, with sometimes a neat gimmick like Guptaros emphasizing the importance of having specific job classes when fighting him, before the gimmick is dropped and never used again outside of the arena for some reason. And these guys make for perfectly serviceable filler bosses, usually to end off a quest line or two. Number 23, rival candidates. So things like Katharina, Loveless, Goddard, Milo, and all the other bit players you face off against in the game. Some of them, like Godot, may have a special gimmick, but they're all pretty similar. If I had to pick the best ones, it'd be Katharina because she's an actual character and you fight her 3 times, and Rudolph because his fight was considerably harder than the others, which is probably a good thing considering the man prides himself on being from the strongest race. Number 22, Sergeant Xanth. Just barely escaping the Fodder Tier, we have Sergeant Xanth, who makes it into meme status because of how dang weak he is to status effects. So you have a few more options to work with, and there's a bit of urgency included in this fight because you're placed on a strict 3-turn time limit to kill him, and I managed to take him out with Heismay using Steel, which does 1 damage. Yeah, that's about it. Number 21, Homo Fulcio. This guy is weird looking, but he's not really hitting Nightmare Fuel levels, just goofy as hell. Fulcio is here to introduce you to your mini-boss tier enemies, foes that aren't as strong or important as the major bosses in the game, but are considerably tougher than the other fodder you've encountered, and you should be approaching them with care. If this was Etrian Odyssey, this would be your first FOE, for example. On top of that, the bombastic boss music does make for a really cool battle, but there's not much else for me to say about it, other than it is one of the only fights you get to battle with Grius in your party. Rep a real one. Number 20, Archdemon Luis. And now we go from the 3rd boss in the game to the 3rd to last boss in the game, and by far the weakest of the in-game bosses, at least in my opinion. Archdemon Luis is honestly pretty disappointing for me because he doesn't do much. He looks cool, but all he really does is attack the party with AoEs over and over again without any real puzzles or gimmicks thrown in, so it just becomes a simple case of hit him till he dies. He may have obtained a greater power with the Royal Scepter, but he lost his swagger in the process, becoming a much weaker boss fight in my eyes. And then, my largest complaint is the boss music. Human by Name is a perfectly serviceable boss theme, but why would you replace Luis's amazing boss theme that he already had for his first 2 fights with a song you've heard 7-ish times by this point? And, to be honest, Human by Name doesn't even make sense here, because Luis isn't counted as a human in this fight. Whatever. This fight sucks, but thankfully there's 2 more battles after that, and spoilers, you won't be seeing them on this list for a good while. Number 19, Homo Gorleo. The first boss of the game, and honestly not a bad one by any means. Out of all the human bosses, Gorleo has by far my favorite design, managing to look spooky but also kinda cool, unlike most Atlas bosses that walk a line of creepy and goofy as hell. Being your tutorial boss, it's pretty much free to win, but it has some nice mechanics such as the apples that can recover his health, so you're taught to target prioritization, and the different attacks that make use of its limbs, so you may want to go to them to have a safer path to victory. I just wish this fight took place later in the game, so all the cool mechanics would really have a chance to truly shine. Oh well. Number 17, Sea Horror Homo Sabara. This is one of the first bosses we ever saw for this game, and honestly, it is kinda neat having a giant sea monster battle, and the tentacles being targets you can destroy to make things easier for yourself. But there's one small problem, at least to me. This jerk can hit you way too many times, and if he gets a critical hit, he's getting an extra turn. Plus, this fight is the start of a lot of bosses having Soul Scream, meaning they can give themselves 4 extra press turns, and you bet your ass that bosses in the late game love to use and abuse this. Combine this with only just having gotten Yuna as a party member, so the game wants you to make use of the party swap mechanic, except it doesn't work when a party member has a status effect, and this boss loves status effects. I don't know. Maybe it's just me, but I wish Yuna's first fight with the full game wasn't against a boss that can kill her in the crossfire, but I guess this does make up for the Caradrius not having a human boss fight, since this battle takes place shortly after that area.
Nothing left. You struggle in vain. I won't let you rob me of my glory. This is the way of the real world, little lordling!
You call this real? Leaders abandon their people and the innocent die by their scorn. If that's the real world, then it can die alongside you!
Captain Klinger is the first boss fight where you get to have a second party member with you. Well, okay, that's kind of a lie, but now Stroll officially joins you as a party member and is controllable, and Grius is also here to help out. Klinger is a pretty straightforward fight, as it's one of the first battles in the game, but you spent the past hour or two really coming to like Stroll, at least I did, and, I don't know, really coming to hate this sack of crap. The fight itself isn't even bad either. Klinger is your first opponent to make use of buffs thanks to his two soldiers backing him up, and he has an igniter allowing him to use fire magic, which is dangerous against our protagonist at this point in the game, so Stroll gets a chance to shine. And while I do think the song is overplayed in this game, Verge of Life and Death is still a good song, and it's first played in this fight, giving an encouraging feeling to take this man out and see what else this game has to offer. Or it would, but he actually survives the battle. Not that it matters, as he gets killed in a cutscene by a boss later on in this game, so yeah. Number 15, Homo Flamo. I wonder if this guy could lend me an ear. But in all seriousness, Flamo is one of the bosses that acts as more of a puzzle than a boss fight. His fight is straightforward, but getting to him has the challenges of his clones being all throughout the Dragon Grace and moving when you move, so you need to be mindful and avoid them to not be dragged into needless battles. But when you get to Flamo, you're not done, as the dude will run away from you, so now you need to make use of the gates to lock him in and force him into a battle, which is pretty easy from that point onwards, but the boss having more puzzle focus before you fight him really fits the dungeon. That's a love letter to the Etrian Odyssey series, and yeah, I enjoy it. Number 14, Homo Jaluzo. Remember when I mentioned a boss that killed Captain Klinger? Well, this is that boss, and to be honest, Jaluzo is freaking terrifying. Something about the innocence of a baby combined with the large size and hyper-violent nature of a human, yeah, I don't know, it just works. This boss has some powerful attacks, meaning that you need to be ready for a lot of damage to come your way, but thankfully there is a way to mitigate this, and that's by targeting his eyes, because when they're destroyed, his accuracy will fall through the floor. It's creepy, it's a bit tragic, and it provides a much greater challenge than any boss prior to it. What's not to love? Number 13, Elegy of Soul. At the end of the really, really long Dragon Trial quest, we have ourselves the super boss, or at least the one you can fight in the main playthrough. The other one is New Game Plus only. And he's pretty fun, albeit pretty difficult. He has every ability you do because he swaps between all the archetypes. Basically, we're fighting a Persona protagonist. It's your solid in-game challenge, but it also has a soft time limit because once he finishes cycling through the archetypes, he's going to start over, but then he'll start using Dragon's Eye every turn, effectively doubling his attacks, at which point you won't really survive. But thankfully, it's still a much more fair and balanced fight than other Atlas super bosses, which are a modern terms and service list worth of fail conditions. In this boss's case, just don't have any equipment that negates damage and you'll be fine, and overall I think it's pretty good, and acts is a good way to wrap up Angrika's questline. And by the way, does anyone else think Angrika looks like Kupala from Etrian Odyssey? Just me? It's probably intentional. Number 12, Homo Avades. Ever notice how early game Atlas bosses tend to have more complex movesets than your mid to late game bosses? Anyways, while Gorleo may have been your first boss, Avades is your first boss to cap off a dungeon. For comparison, think of Gorleo as Shadow Yosuke and Avades as Shadow Yukiko. The design of this boss is wild, being one of the monsters depicted in those Bosch paintings, and there's a lot going on here, with the arms that will attack you while also providing some defense for the body, the eggshell, which is weak to bash and stuns the boss when destroyed, but will infinitely reform, and the heart, that uses light magic primarily and is your main target but is nearly impossible to hit unless the boss has been stunned. And after you break the eggshell, he has Birdmen show up inside the body to act as an enemy ambush that you need to stop or you're going to be taking a lot of damage. There's a lot going on in this fight, but it's overall fairly fun, and it really cements that this game is going to be a wild adventure, and also something unforgettable. Number 11. The first battle with Great Worm Homo Butera. Get to the anus! The reason Butera gets this high for his first battle is because, guess what, it doesn't have in-game levels of HP, and instead it acts as a large, somewhat bulky opponent for you to face off against until it drops to around 1/3 of his health, where he decides to devour you and turn into his own mini-dungeon. In this dungeon, you're on a time limit, and you need to get to the end and pick up any treasures you may wish, as the gear found here is far ahead of anything else at this point in the game, and it contains an optional mini-boss you can face off against before getting off with a decent boss fight against the parasitic Valmo. I don't have much else to say about this fight, it's pretty good. Okay, fine, I'll say it one more time. Get to the anus!
We're on a mission here.
Ah! Enough! Stop this infernal din!
The cutscene leading up to this boss fight always gets a good laugh out of me. Anyways, you fight Heizme twice, but only the second fight is real, so I'm only counting him on this list once. Heizme is a good boss that's a bit on the easy side because he's actively holding back against you, but he's also a boss that creates false clones of himself. Going for AoEs won't work, but if you're paying attention, you'll notice only the real body casts a shadow. It's a simple gimmick, but he's one of the best character bosses in the game, in my opinion, and I can appreciate getting a boss fight against someone who ends up becoming a party member. And while simple, I think the gimmick is a nice little wrinkle for the early game as a way of showing the player screen nukes aren't always going to be the option for multiple targets. Something especially important to know when you're going to be battling with Jaluzo, who will punish such mistakes with heavy damage instead of just a few extra attacks. Number 9. Gladel. Gladel, like Zorba, is another of Luis's main men, though instead of being super loyal to the point of simping, like Zorba, he actually kinda hates Luis and would love nothing more than to kill him. This fight is a solid 2v2 with Yuna joining your side for the first time. Honestly, this is one of the easiest fights in the game, but it kinda works here because Gladel isn't that strong. He resorts to dirty tricks throughout the story, and in the boss fight, he's mostly focusing on buffing up Hector to do the real damage. But I like the way the King's magic works here, as it isn't some ass pull where we're now popular enough to hurt him, but instead, Yuna tricks Gladel into having this fight turn into a duel, which removes the protection of the King's magic. Then, after you've won, Gladel tries to cheat, which ends up resulting in the magic backfiring against him, and also the one and only time in the game we actually see the King's magic take someone's life. Otherwise, it's normally just used to hold someone down and then they get shanked by whoever they were trying to attack. Number 8. Melancholized Zorba. Unlike the first fight against Zorba, this one actually puts up some level of opposition, having a lot of in-game spells, a twisted design showing a half-transformed version of a human, but he also has a gimmick where he'll surround himself in bones to increase his defenses and buff up, and you need to find a way to destroy the barrier. You have two options here, either force a weakness and destroy it yourself, or send in Gallica to handle it for you without using a press turn, but he'll become enraged for the next turn, making him far more aggressive, so be careful when considering this option. I think it provides a good in-game challenge as the last fight against any of Luis's generals, now that Yuna and Basilio have joined your side. Gladel got his neck snapped, and Fidelio, well, rest in peace, dude. That being said, at this point, I was beyond sick of the song Verge of Life and Death, but thankfully this is the last time it plays in the game. But I have to wonder why this song and not Human by Name or Formidable Foe was used for this fight. This isn't a tragic boss, no matter how Zorba tries to spin it, he was a total sack of crap, and I'm glad he dies here. Number 7. Undead Grius. From the boss that ended the last dungeon to the boss that starts the first dungeon, we have, in my opinion, the best of the early game bosses, against one of your party members that had been killed earlier in the game. Grius is a boss that really emphasizes the anxiety status effect as a really bad thing you don't want on your characters, and now, with Aislinn awakening her archetype, this is your first boss using close to a full party. It's not hard, but he has a larger moveset than most bosses up to this point, and it doesn't have the chance to outstay its welcome, while having enough going for it that he doesn't turn into a derivative punching bag thanks to his phantasm attacks. I kinda wish we could've used those when he was on our side though, if I'm being perfectly honest, but oh well, it's still a good fight that hits the tragedy home, and I'd say, again, the best of the early game fights.
His Highness and Maria's home. I leave them in your hands.
Number 6, Rella and Sagne. And now for the second of the two bosses that actually did feel like an emotional gut punch. Sagne is different from the other dragons in that it has unique animations and doesn't just spam a crapload of buffs before nuking your party. Instead, it will try to whittle away at you, and it'll tag out to let Rella take some turns for either support or attacking, but it should be noted that, at least in my playthrough, Rella never went and harmed Yuna, which I found interesting. And when I fought her, yeah, it was cool. And when Sagne runs out of health, she uses her life to heal him back, making the fight enter a pinch mode of sorts, where Sagne gets more attacks, but no longer has Rella's defenses to keep him safe. This is what I would consider to be probably the hardest boss in the main story, other than maybe the final boss. Overall, I think this is a great fight that sends off a good character, and I appreciate that she tries to feign being evil so Yuna and the party wouldn't hesitate to kill her, but very quickly fails to keep up the veneer because you learn that while she was the one that cursed the prince, it was when she was a child and Forden threatened to kill her little sister Yuna, and her final words were being able to sway even Godot, that asshat, to lend you a helping hand. Though, there's two things keeping this boss fight out of the amazing tier for me, and that's the fact that she, once again, has Verge of Life and Death play as a boss theme, which has definitely become overplayed by this point in the game, and the Magic Academy, at least to me, was hyped up for quite a bit of the game, but instead of being another grand dungeon to explore, it just ends up being a cutscene with a boss fight. Oh well, still a good boss fight. Just kinda wish we would have gotten a proper dungeon out of it.
Come then, and act your part in this showdown. I have a new world to build, and you will die in its name.
Hey guys, did you know that Luis strikes to kill? Did you know that he strikes to kill? Did you know that? He strikes to kill. Anyways, I'm combining both fights against Luis together as they're both fun, but also just barely miss out on the amazing tier for one reason or another. His boss theme is awesome, and I'm glad the main villain gets his own kick-ass boss theme even outside of the endgame, though it makes me wonder why his theme was replaced in his archdemon form, but I've already harped on that. His first fight is very straightforward as he only uses single target attacks, but I wouldn't call it an easy boss as he'll exploit even the smallest openings and quickly turn the tide, but it has a cool as hell ending where you impale him and send him plummeting down onto the stage of the Opera House thanks to a play from Yufa, my personal favorite party member. Though, I genuinely thought he was going to die there, but the dude is so good at 4D chess he ends up being his own twist villain, and we fight him again back where the game more or less began on the stage of Grand Trad. This time around, he's added Soul Scream into his arsenal to give himself some much needed additional turns, and he can change the element of his sword so he can strike whatever weakness he sees, and despite this technically being the final boss, you don't have any way to stack yourself with immunities to everything, so you'll just have to decide where you want to take your lumps against Luis. This is a no bullshit straightforward fight to the point that, well, I think it's one of the best in the game, though it falls ever so slightly short for me because once he drops to critical health, the fight gets interrupted for plot and it never concludes until the endgame. I don't know, I really wish it would have gone until he was defeated or until he hit 1 HP, but unfortunately it ever so slightly misses the mark of being amazing, but still a really climactic fight worthy of the main antagonist.
Not enough, I'm afraid.
Lord Luis!
A fine blow. You've surprised me.
Number 4, more Hythlodeus. The second to last boss fight in the game, and if you choose to keep on fighting, More will become furious with you for wanting to dive back into a losing battle where you'll surely get killed. So, the fight makes its way into space for a one-on-one scrap, and yeah, it's easy, but man is it satisfying. More is throwing everything and the kitchen sink at you, but you're able to shrug it off by this point in the game, if you're strong enough. But you'll also have to prove to him that you can win on your own power, and not just because you're having your teammates do everything. It's a plot boss, but what gets it so high up into the amazing tier, at least for me, is because I'm not immune to hype or having awesome music play, and Traversing the Waste is, in my opinion, the best song in the entire game. Having it play for this fight really elevated it for me to something special. This fight is no frills, no BS, just two guys beating the crap out of each other while the best track in the game backs it up, and I kinda love it. Number 3, Malvrita Draco Et. At the end of my favorite dungeon, we have the best dragon fight in the game. Et is supposed to be... well, Et is possessed by Homo Margo, so our main target is obviously the little jackass on the back. But that won't be enough to win the fight, because Et is currently so far gone that unfortunately we have to take it down as well. It's a 2-target boss, so you have to decide what you want to do. Because of their different affinities, screen nukes aren't always the best option. So the question is, do you want to take out Margo first, or bring down Et? In some ways, it might be easier, and it might be worthwhile keeping Margo alive, as it'll sap health from Et, but Margo has ways to make the fight last much longer. On top of that, I'm biased, so... because, well, this is the boss where Yuffie joins the party, and she's my favorite party member, becoming a mainstay once she joined the team and basically never leaving the team. A fantastic boss to mark the halfway point of the game, in my opinion. Christian in post-production here, you may have noticed that I didn't actually include a boss fight earlier on, and the numbers I was saying and putting on the screen weren't quite matching up. Well, that's because originally I had Homo Margo listed separately, much lower on the list. And to be honest, a lot of my claims sounded really stupid. It was like, oh, it doesn't make any sense, his weakness has changed. Like, no, just pay attention. I was being an idiot. The fight here is actually pretty good. It's your standard boss changes his elemental weakness, so you need to pay attention to what he's doing. I do think I wish the auras were a little bit more clear what he was weak to, but ultimately, if you just look at the attacks he's using, just use the opposite affinity of that and you'll be fine. It's a good boss. And it definitely doesn't deserve to be crapped on like I was doing, so I decided, you know what, I'll combine it here with Et because it deserves it. It's a good fight. Number 2, Homo Gorleo, Round 2. Remember what I said about Homo Gorleo having the potential to be one of the best bosses in the game if it wasn't being bogged down by tutorials? Well, here we are. As the guardian of the endgame, Homo Gorleo acts as the final human you'll face off against in the game. Well, kind of. I mean, there's Zorba, but whatever. And now all his different mechanics, such as the apples and various limbs being used for attacks, are given a chance to truly shine. And honestly, the fight's not an easy one, it's pretty tough. You're in the endgame now, and Gorleo is going to make sure you're ready for the last few boss fights. I've always been in the mindset that if you're going to reuse a boss, it's best to reuse one of the first bosses and just evolve it in a way to show what they're capable of, and also show how far the player has come. And also just what the boss can do when it's not constrained by early game tutorials and limitations, and in my opinion, they nailed it here. It's a fantastic fight, it's one of my favorite in the entire game, but of course, there's one fight that's better, and at this point you've already pieced together which boss it is. Number 1, Destroyer Caradrius. Yeah, there wasn't really any other fight that it could have been. Atlas pretty universally nails their final boss battles, or they fuck them up so badly that they'd be at the bottom of the list. Looking at you, Etrian Odyssey Fafnir Knight. And Luis is here to be a 2-phase final boss fight, while also being a satisfying conclusion to the game. That being said, this fight is brutally difficult, being quite possibly the toughest in the game, other than maybe Sagne, with Phase 1 having 3 different faces with different elemental affinities that you need to keep in mind, or you could just have Basilio continuously whack him because Bonk is almighty. It's not almighty, but it's all powerful. And you don't want to fall asleep here, as he'll also have a move where he offers up a puppet of one of the 7 races to sacrifice, allowing him to deal some heavy damage or buff himself to an insane level, so you want to destroy that puppet before he can perform the sacrifice. It's a neat gimmick that keeps you focused, and you have to think on your toes and be quick. Thankfully, their HP is low enough that usually this only diverts 1 or 2 attacks and not all of them for that turn, so you can still clock some good damage in. Basilio was the MVP of this fight, that's for sure. Then you get to the final phase, which looks absolutely terrifying by the way, but everything in the kitchen sink is being thrown at you here, and it's going to be an ultimate test of skills, as this is the hardest fight in the game, in my opinion. He's got a bunch of the strongest attacks to keep in mind, he's got the ability to give himself extra press turns, and he's got a special attack where he'll condemn one of the races to instant death, so you need to get them out of there. Dude must have an iFunny account or something because he's mastered the power of racism. Either way, that also means you need to keep track of who's in the party and swap them out before Luis does this attack so they don't get killed and taken out. Thankfully though, even if they do, you could just use Balm of Light. This isn't something like Trails Through Daybreak where the party member is forcibly removed from the battle permanently, thank the Lord. Either way though, the visuals are awesome, the music is good, Luis is a fantastic villain, and there's even a puzzle aspect to the fight, as you can weaken him before the battle begins by destroying the 6 Magla crystals throughout the Tyrant Star, in order to weaken Luis. Or, if you're crazy, you can go full balls in the fight if you want the achievement making for one of the hardest fights in, well, any game that Atlas has made. And that choice, at least in my opinion, makes this a stellar final boss fight, and a great way to cap off this game. And what a game it was. And that does it for this ranking. Metaphor ReFantazio is a fantastic game that feels like a celebration of Atlas games as a whole, and I'm glad they didn't just stick to pandering to Persona and SMT, but even showed significant love towards some of their smaller franchises such as Etrian Odyssey. While my personal favorite game of 2024 is probably Ys 10, I acknowledge I am biased as hell towards that series, and if I'm being objective, this is the best game of 2024, which was a surprisingly solid year of titles from not quite as large developers. Anyways, that's the video. If you enjoyed, consider liking and subscribing to see more videos of varying quality, and I'll see you all next time. Take care.